Okay, welcome everybody to the 10th session of Sitecore Headless Development User Group. Today we have two speakers lined up, and I will also start this meeting with sharing some news about what's happening hot in the Sitecore world and in Headless world. Today with us we have Artsem and we have Navneet. They will be talking about the multisite, another interesting approach to multisite, and another insightful GraphQL session. So that is our agenda for the day. But before I even start with the first speaker, I would like to share some news about our main tool for these days, which is Next.Js. Last month, I went in person to Next.Js conference, which took place in San Francisco. That was the time when they introduced the version 15 of Next.js and lots of other things. So I would like to briefly speak about that and what do we have along with it. So I would say 15 is truly innovative in some way, but the other thing that Vercel seriously worked on their mistakes done previously in version 14. So previously, they made some questionable decisions. For example, they were quite rushing with the release. They maintained rigid options despite the community feedback. I'm talking about changes like rewriting the fetch API, implementing hard caching, and yes, especially hard caching, introducing numerous bugs, among other issues. And more, they were overlooking community requests. So it nearly took a year for the team to recognize that all these approaches were ineffective to begin, and they began addressing the underlying problems. So with the release of version 15, there is a final sense that framework is truly meeting the needs for the community, and it has success as it was doing previously in the old iterations. So we have now React version 19, and it's a very unusual situation. So I won't get into more details how release candidate of React was introduced and all these jumps with the stable version, not stable version. Long story short, currently Next.js employs two different React configurations. So we have React 19 Canary for the app router, and we still have React 18, the previous one, for the page router. So interestingly, there was initial plan to integrate React 19 versions for the page router as well, but however, these changes were rolled back for uncertain reason. I think it's related to all this Canary and the release candidates from React. So we got new component. We know and we love image and link components from Next.js. Now we have form component. So that's kind of innovation, but it's already familiar for those who know React DOM, and it's basically some improvements. You primarily benefit from this Next.js implementation of form in the cases when a successful form submission involves some sort of transition to another page. So in that case, you get loading TSX, layout TSX abstraction, and the following page gets preloaded while the form is getting submitted. They worked also on developer experience. One thing that I want to point is ESLint. So now version 9 is supported. And this is interesting because ESLint version 8, the previous version, and some of its dependencies, they already marked as deprecated. So because of that, we forced essentially to keep deprecated packages. So this is no longer a case for us happening. There is some minor cosmetical but helpful improvements, like a button to copy the call stack for debugging and troubleshooting purposes. You also can open the source of the error on a specific line. They also added static indicator. This is an element on the corner of the page that shows the page was built in a static mode. And you may know that pre-built indicator was already with us for some time. So it was slightly updated and adapted for app router. One more new improvement, they get .next/diagnostic folder for storing debug information. And I would say they mostly will be using this folder for themselves, but still one can find information about the build process and the errors that occur. Sometimes you will find it helpful to pass the problems. Quite good improvements on documentation. Eventually, I don't know why it was not done before, but now they version the documentation. So people still work on old version like Next.Js 12, Next.Js 13. They have 2 and 4 millions correspondingly. Developers still want to work with these versions, and the documentation must be specific for their setups, because sometimes the latest documentation may include significant changes that are entirely not compatible to their projects. So now they provide this version documentation, and Vercel ensures that developers have reliable resources and the knowledge about them very accurately, precisely tailored. Next thing, even bigger thing, TurboPack. So it's not something new. It was released in previous version, but kind of release, I say. So now it's fully complete for development mode. 100% of existing tests ran with no errors for TurboPack. And I think 96 or 97% for the production version. So it's going there, it's coming there, and it's powerful. So what do we know about TurboPack? It's extremely fast and it's reliable now. It's also introduced a range of new features that enhance functionality and, of course, as I say, address performance. One of them, tree shaking. So you know tree shaking from Tailwind. This is, in other words, basically removal of unused code base, so it doesn't go into the bundle. You can now set the limit for TurboPack. That's another cool thing. So just these 2 TurboPack changes alone, they reduced memory usage by maybe by a third or maybe by a quarter, and speed up also like 30 to 50%, which is a significant change. Also, historically, there were some changes with styles, especially in version 14. There were some situations when the styles were broken. I mean, not the styles, but the order of styles was broken during the navigation. And because of that, style A could become higher than style B, and they were jumping. So because of that priority, the element may look different. So now they addressed this issue as well. So another improvement, you can now do config in TypeScript for the Next.js. I don't know if it's available, but well, now you can do it strongly typed, same as you do everything else. Also, now you can do a retry for page generation. So why would you need that? Maybe your request, if you build static page, your request failed to go there. So now you can do several attempts to get this. There is a property, it's still marked as experimental, but it's called static generation retry count. So you set it to 3 and it will do 3 consecutive attempts before the page fails to build. API changes also, I would call interesting changes. So version 15, cookies, headers, params, search params, these all guys now become asynchronous operations. So these are synchronous objects. It's interesting. The change is big. So they say they Vercel and Next.js team, they suggest one CLI command that can automatically change these API usages for your project. If you're familiar with code mod, that is it. I wrote about it in my blog. So caching, I mentioned caching in version 14 was aggressive and was very, very questionable. So actually now fetch uses no store value by default instead of forced cache. So, okay, that's what we wanted. API routes use forced dynamic mode by default, because previously it was forced static by default. Caching in the client router has also been disabled. And what else? Moreover, if client caching is enabled, it most likely will be updated to the correct time, namely if the enabled page cache on a server expires. Server components are now cached in the development mode. And just because of that, updates in development become faster. You can also reset cache by reloading a page, or you can completely disable the functionality through web config. They have a kill switch for that. And you also can control cache control header, which was previously always overwritten with internal values of Next.js. So now these given to developers, these historically caused artifacts while caching with CDN. Now it's no longer. Next, dynamic cache modules for use, also a thing. And now moving to the next topic, which is partial pre-rendering, also known as PPR. And that may be like a main teaser for the whole release. So what is PPR? This is a mode for page assembly in which Next.js pre-renders and caches as much of the code as possible, while some individual elements are still built on each request. So in this case, the pre-assembled part is immediately sent to client and the remainings are loaded dynamically. So it's a very interesting mode. This feature existed already for 6 months, as I remember, and it was in the release candidate as an experimental API. So another change is partial fallback pre-renderings, which is improvement where the pre-assembled part is immediately sent to the client and the rest loaded dynamically. So at this time, a callback component is shown in place of dynamic elements. So this is the idea about it. Okay, interceptor. What is interceptor? Another new thing. It's a road level middleware. It feels as something like a full-fledged existing middleware, but unlike that, it can work in Node.js runtime. It works on a server, and therefore it has access to the environment and single cache. It can be added multiple times and is nesting inherited like middleware worked when it wasn't better. It works among the other things for server functions. So one thing to keep in mind, if you go with interceptor, all the pages underneath the tree, they become dynamic. That is important to know. Finally, the big elephant in the room, Vercel v0. So what is Vercel v0? It's a generative AI, something that was mentioned more than a year ago on a previous Vercel event. I remember they were mentioning it. And it's still not in a general availability, despite they generously give everyone to play with this tool. And I played around it. Of course, the first thing I did was dealing and targeting it against Sitecore. So it successfully created me Sitecore configurations and everything I need for XM Cloud project. So it's aware of this particular setup, and I was quite happy and amazed to see what it can do. So it's quite a groundbreaking feature. I would say it combined the best practices of front-end development with the full potential of generative AI, which is the big thing in our days. So yes, it's still in beta, but I believe it's coming out shortly. So you see our tool belt enriched with lots of interesting things, and I was quite excited to see that from the first hands. So that was my update from Next.js event and Vercel. I also want to briefly touch what we have big according to Sitecore. It will be a very short one, but as you know, we now, so all you know, Foundation Hat, right? If you work with XM Cloud, you're familiar. This is the starter kit that Sitecore provides to us. And that's the one that used Docker as the only way of doing local development. So now they are restructuring XM Cloud Foundation HUD. So they do apply some logical approach to structuring the code, and they do some interesting changes. The biggest I would call, which is front-end development, front-end first development. So that change, it's already in a repo, and this is when developer runs the HUD application locally, and they're only pulling the data directly from XM Cloud instead of mocking some of the services locally using Docker. So this switch makes it simpler for new developers getting up and running with XM Cloud, and of course improving speed of development for day-to-day purposes. I can say from my experience on a big XM Cloud project I worked summertime, we had different people from different business units join us, and there were front-end developers who were doing Conveyor search specifically, all have MacBooks, and they had to get Windows laptops instead, and it appeared to be very complicated for them to run Docker because of limited resources, which they actually didn't need other way around than running Docker. So Sitecore listens to us and they're addressing it. So of course you will ask, does it mean that Docker is not a big thing any longer? The answer is no. Docker will stay with us. It's only changing the priority. So front-end first becomes the preferred approach rather than one with the Docker. So what does it mean for us if you go the front-end first approach? There will be less customizations, obviously, and there are still questions about how do you move the content to the cloud and how would you deal with shared content, serialization questions. But at least it's better to have options rather than not having them. So I would like to suggest reading the blog post from Rob Earlham. That is the guy standing behind Foundation HUD, and in general, probably one of the most knowledgeable person in the Sitecore development team. So that was it from my side. If there are any questions, shout out. If not, I'm happy to pass to the following speaker, Artyom.
Today, I'm going to present my new topic, and the topic is about Sitecore multi-site solutions. And it is not quite something like rocket science. We will talk about the pretty simple things, but we will look at them a bit deeper, compare different approach to build the multi-site solutions, and we will identify some pros and cons. So yeah, let's go. And let me start with some short introduction of myself. My name is Artsem Prashkovich, and I have more than 13 years of programming experience. Primarily, I was working on the backend side, but also had some experience with the front end. Since April 2012, I work for Brimit and currently take a position of the solution architect. I have more than 13 years, no, not more, I have around 13 years of experience in Sitecore, and I was awarded at Sitecore Technology MVP for 7 times in a row, if I'm not mistaken. And talking about my hobbies, for a few last years, I fell in love with yachting. I obtained different licenses, and last years I organized some weekly trips on the catamarans with my family, with the friends, and so that's quite interesting trips, and we have a good time. But let's go further with the presentation. And first thing that I want to say a few words is XM Cloud. I'm pretty sure that everybody already heard about the XM Cloud, and even almost all of you have the experience with that. But anyway, just a few words to identify what is it. And actually, XM Cloud is cloud version of Sitecore Experience Manager, which is also called like XM. And basically, this is the cloud-based content management system, and being a CMS, it allows us to create, manage, and deploy digital content with the flexibility of cloud technology. Again, being a cloud platform or SaaS platform, it takes the full responsibility to manage the infrastructure, the hardware and software infrastructure of the platform, to be responsible for the upgrades and maintenance, as well as the scalability and performance improvements. So as a user of the system of the platform, we shouldn't think about it ourselves. So this is something that Sitecore is responsible for. XM Cloud provides some pretty useful tools like a deployment tool that allow us to bring our changes into the environment quickly. And the last point is that headless CMS, which means that we have to implement and also host our rendering host or rendering part of our solution ourselves. So it can be hosted in different ways. Even it can be hosted on some on-premise environment, which I'm highly not recommend to do, because using say the SaaS platform or cloud-based platform on the outsourcing part, it no makes sense to limit ours with the on-prem technologies anyway. So, but the most popular way and probably the best way to host our front-end part, front-end rendering host, let's say, in such tools like Vercel or Netlify or the similar. But once the Vercel is a partner of the Sitecore, we will talk about it at that tool today. Vercel is a cloud platform that enables developers to deploy, manage, and scale web applications or websites easily. It is pretty popular hosting for Next.Js, and it is actually, first of all, because the company which stay behind Vercel is also the creator of the Next.js. But anyway, Vercel supports the wide range of front-end frameworks anyway. So, and static, as well as the static generators, making this platform universal. Vercel provides serverless functions capabilities, allowing developers to run backend code without managing a separate server. It uses a global content delivery network, also known as a CDN, to ensure that websites and applications are fast and responsive, regardless of where the user is located. And again, so it supports not only the Next.js, it's also optimized for the rest of the front-end technologies and frameworks like React, Vue.js, and Angular. Being a cloud and SaaS platform, it is also handles the scaling automatically. So developers don't need to worry about the traffic surges and managing the infrastructure. Vercel collect the analytics for us, and it is quite good tool that help us to analyze and monitor in the system and improve the performance based on the metrics that we can reach from the Vercel. Okay, and now we can go further to the actually the main topic of the presentation is multi-site. But first, let's identify actually the companies that the organizations that might need to have the multi-site, because from my point of view, this is the origin of the Sitecore, that the almost all project that I took apart previously was the multi-site. I think it is because the Sitecore targeting the middle market or even the enterprise level clients, they usually have multi-site. But let's see. I think multi-level organizations usually require the multi-site solutions, like University of Oxford. So then we have like university and different departments have their own websites. So and then it is pretty much to the requirement to be a multi-site solution. For example, there is a multi-brand organizations like Go to the Foods with their Cinnabon, Auntie Aunts, and etc. brands owned. Also, it can be like global companies with regional websites like Amazon or any other, and a list of other e-commerce platforms, IKEA, for example. This is the cases when the multi-site makes sense. And the first approach to reach our multi-sites requirement is on my diagram, and all my diagrams will be based on the fact that we have 3 websites, site alpha, site beta, and gamma, and at least okay, in the first diagram we have 3 applications running in the Vercel, and that pretty common case of the implementation for multi-site, and it is the case when we have 3 applications defined in our repository. So all of 3 websites has own code base, which allow us to, and which is required actually, to have own pipelines, own CI/CD process to deploy the websites to the Vercel. And from another side, we have the XM Cloud with 3 websites defined, and in this case, we also have the editing hosts running within the XM Cloud, and we have the the own CI/CD process for the XM Cloud, which is pulling code, let's say, from the authoring directory or from the authoring repository, where we manage and add some customizations and extensions for our XM Cloud instance. And if you see that we have 3 different pipelines to deploy our websites, for the XM Cloud, we can have only one pipeline which will deploy everything in the same time. So we cannot separate the deployment of XM Cloud authoring part and editing host, or even we cannot deploy one of the editing hosts separately. So in the case of the implementing headless solution within the XM Cloud, we also need I also need to mention about the Sitecore Experience Age, which plays a role of the content provider for the websites, and basically comparing it with the previous approach to build Sitecore solutions, like using Sitecore Experience Platform, it plays a role of the web database where we store our production ready content. And actually we publish our sites to the Sitecore Experience Age platform. And making the request from the website to the Age, we specify the context ID as well as the site name. So it allows the Age platform to figure out the content that you actually request. And the context ID is a quite new stuff in Sitecore in the XM Cloud. I cannot say exactly what it was introduced, but I'm just mentioning it a few months ago that it was added to the admin panel. Maybe it was added early. But anyway, I will talk about the context IDs a bit later. I have the separate diagram for that. So for me, this is like the most popular or more maybe regular view of the multi-site applications, because it is how we actually build it before we got the XM Cloud released. So we always had like own code for each website, own views, and maybe some shared components. But anyway, so this is the regular view. Let's have a look to the next diagram, which also quite similar to the previous one, with only one difference that we can use our applications running in Vercel as an external editing host for our sites in XM Cloud. Like even if we use the pages or we use the experience editor, so that we can use the apps running in Vercel as editing hosts. I put it. I put the example just for the Gamma site, but each of the sites should be configured to use the corresponding application running in the Vercel as their own editing host. So what actually happened when we open the pages or experience editor, Sitecore XM Cloud, send a request to the editing endpoint in our application, as well as putting the object that we are representing the page that we are going to edit in a body of the request. And then our application prepare the markup for the editing tool and responded to the tool. One more important thing is that to make pages working correctly in Vercel, so the pages working correctly with the external editing host running in Vercel, we have to introduce some cache storage for our Vercel app. And there is different options. It can be the storage, Redis storage running in the Vercel itself, or we can use the external Redis cache for this reason. One of our clients, Vercel, wasn't the storage provided in Vercel was not available for the license that our client purchased. So then we had to run the Redis cache separately. But it is fully described in a Sitecore documentation, and I will put the link later on. Everything else is similar as we had before. We have separate pipelines to deploy websites, and we have one pipeline to deploy our XM Cloud, but with only the difference that we are not deploying the editing host anymore. So the deployment to the XM Cloud will happen faster. Let's go further, and the next diagram represents a bit different approach to build the same. In that case, our rendering host is configured to use Multisite add-on. This is the part of the SXA starter kit provided by Sitecore, and it actually helps us to identify which site we are requesting from our browser. So in my example, we use only one rendering application. So we have the code base for the authoring with customizations for the XM Cloud, and we have the code for our rendering host. And all our websites use the same app, so and the same code, which means, and depending of the host that we send the request from, we will be identify which site we actually request, and so based on the site, and we will identify the site and put the site to the requested agent. The agent at the same time will respond us the corresponding content. So the only the difference here is that we have one pipeline to deploy our frontend app. We have one pipeline to deploy our XM Cloud, and actually, once we are still using our rendering host as an editing host, we still need run the Redis cache. So I will not go deeper to the way how actually the site resolver works. So I think it was introduced a lot of times already. Let's go further with a similar approach, again, we have one application hosted in our repository. We have one pipeline to deploy this application to the Vercel, and we have used the editing host running in the XM Cloud. In that case, even if we have one application in the Vercel, we still need to run 3 editing hosts inside of the XM Cloud. So even it is a copy of the same applications of the same code, because XM Cloud only allows us to run editing host per site, so we cannot share editing hosts for different websites. Okay, and the next approach is do the same to deploy separate applications per website in Vercel, but still using the same code base. And for our clients, it is probably the most common case of using that to build the applications. So all the same, we have one code base, but we have separate pipelines to deploy the same code 3 times in the Vercel. So it allows us to deploy some particular site if you want, even if we still are not ready to deploy the rest. The use cases of that when we introduce new components in our code, but not all of the business teams, if we have different business teams responsible for the different websites, are not ready to get this code to their website. So then we can actually deploy it separately, but we always need to be care of the changes that we made on the Sitecore side, because if we have made some changes on the templates or etc., so then and we deploy them to the XM Cloud, or even we just made these changes on the XM Cloud itself, so we can broke our front end up. So then we should be careful with that. And we usually use our rendering host in Vercel as an editing host as well. So then this is the case when this is the way how we usually build it. Now the time to talk about context ID that I was mentioning in the beginning. And before the context ID was introduced, we had 2 different GraphQL endpoints. The first one is experience age that we was talking about before, and in case we wanted to reach some preview content, which actually comes from the master database, we had to request the GraphQL endpoint from the CM server itself, which means that we had to share somehow our content management host name to our web application, kind of make it shared. So for sure it was in environment variables or somewhere else, but again we had 2 endpoints which provide some more complexity. With introduction of the context ID, we only need to set Sitecore H context ID variable for our applications with the certain values, and the values can be of there is only 2 IDs associated with each environment. So we have the context ID for preview and context ID for the live content. And if we set the live content context ID, and we send the request with this ID to the age, it identifies if it's live context ID or not. And if it is, it just responds the corresponding content from the storage, age storage, which actually means the live or production content. But if it is not live ID, it is identify if the ID exists at all. If no, it just responds that it is respond the 44 error, meaning that we have put wrong context ID, or if it's identify and find some equivalent for the preview context ID, it just proxy the request to the Sitecore XM Cloud and respond us the content from XM Cloud from the master database, which is actually considering as a preview. So which makes things easy. We only have one endpoint that we use, even if we want to get the preview content or the live content. We just need to set the proper context ID for our environment variables. When I was identified that we have this context ID stuff introduced, I just tried to test it. And first thing that I got that I should be able to test it with the GraphQL playground. And I tried to do that in certain different ways. I tried to put it as a query stream parameters. I tried to put it as a header, HTTP headers to the corresponding window. So nothing works for me. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe it shouldn't work. I don't know, but I was not able to manage it to get it working. So then I go to another way, and I just send a post request to the GraphQL endpoint within my Postman tool, and I put the Sitecore context ID as a query string to the URL, and actually introduce the GraphQL query in a body. And finally, I got it working, so we can actually test the queries with the Postman, just changing the context ID in a URL. And finally, where we can find this context ID. So in XM Cloud deploy tool, for the particular environment in details tab, you can find actually two values for context IDs. You can regenerate it here if you think it was corrupted or something like that. But yeah, they are here, and depending what you use, you will choose which content you will retrieve from the edge. Okay, now the time to identify some pros and cons. Regardless the approaches that we can use. And talking about the pros and cons, I will identify pros to use a multiple apps approach, multiple apps running in the Vercel, comparing it with the standalone app serving the traffic for all our websites. And first of all, if you have the multiple applications running in the same time, so you can run the deployments and build in the parallel, so which can increase the time of the build. But in the same time, in using this approach, you can reach the limit, the age rate limit, when you run the build in a parallel. So because when we do the build, we build all pages and we try to retrieve the content for all of them at the same time in a parallel. So which means that we can reach the limit. So from another side, having the multiple application, we can deploy only one application and keep rest of them is unupdated. It is what I'm saying before, and actually it can be the pros, but we always need to be careful with the updates that we do on the Sitecore side. So again, if we have the standalone application, we can standalone applications which serves all our traffic for all our websites. And when we run the build of that standalone application, we have to regenerate the cache for all our sites and pages, which means that we cannot compare it with the approach when we run them separately and deploy only one application. We regenerate content for the only application that we want to deploy. But in case of the standalone, we regenerate it for everything, which definitely increase the time of the build and deployment. Having multiple apps running in Vercel, we can proceed kind of canary deployments. For example, if we want to deploy, and if we have our geo-distributed websites running separately, we can deploy the content or deploy the applications to only one of them or to the several of them, which allow us to test it properly with the real traffic. And if everything works as expected, then we can complete our deployments to the rest of the regions, for example, or we can simulate kind of A/B testing with our application, so something like that. Okay, and a few more pros and cons, and the first one is so all of them about the performance, but running application in Vercel per website, we just follow the original way to run Next.Js applications, which definitely are not affected the performance, and it doesn't probably make it faster, but it doesn't make it slower for sure. And if we run our application within the multi-site DOM running on it, so we should resolve the site on each request, which may affect the performance. It may not, but in some cases, it depending how many websites you have and etc. and how many hosts you have associated with the website, it can a little bit affect your performance. But I think it's not be in all cases, but sometimes. Running multiple applications, if you go in a way of multiple applications running, we can identify and specify the 44 and 500 error pages separately for each website. But with the standalone approach, we can have the common 44 and 500 errors page for each website, and we cannot separate it and we cannot specify their own error pages for each website. And probably the last one, pros that identify for multiple apps approach is that you collect your analytics data for each website separately. Then the analytics will provide it to you in more accurate and readable way, because you will have the only statistics data and metrics for particular websites. So you don't need to kind of filter the results, the analytics by websites, and try to analyze where the traffic comes from. So you will understand the fully valuable analytic for your particular websites. And now a few words about deployment strategies. And on this diagram, I try to represent the way how Vercel and XM Cloud try to push us to proceed the deployment. So actually, it was emphasized a few times that you can only configure your webhook to your repository, which will send the request to the Vercel when we do some pull request push in a branch, and the deployment will happen automatically. Vercel will pull the latest code, run the build, and deploy the app for us. The same on the XM Cloud. It can work in a similar way. Also, the webhook, which will identify that new code came to the repository and pull it and proceed deployment, build and deployment. Everything seems easy, and probably it will work if you have only one application, or it is pretty simple application when you have the only XM Cloud and Vercel in your infrastructure, as well as you have only one repository, the common repository for all your stuff. Because in that case, you will be able to make sure that each push to the branch will deploy both parties. So then they are synchronized. But even if you have the same number of components in your infrastructure, but you have two different repositories stored in the front-end app and Sorin, which will means that you push them separately, it can kind of raise some mismatching between the version of the code between in XM Cloud that we deploy to the XM Cloud and Vercel. So then it still can work, but you should be care of the changes that you made on both parties. So because they potentially can be deployed in different way and something can be broken in some time. But again, it is pretty simplified architecture. Talking about the real project that we had with our customer, we have much more parties in the table. So we have the Content Hub, XM Cloud, we have the Order Cloud, we have Vercel with 33 plus apps running on it. We have the Azure with own API gateways and some web apps running on it. Even it is simplified way of what we have run for this customer. I've just put the most large parties of that. But we have to deploy at least XM Cloud, we have to deploy to the Azure, we have to deploy more than 30 applications to the Vercel, and it is quite impossible to do in a way as we talking before, because we should keep it under the control where and what we deploy, and we want to be pretty clear. We want to pretty clearly understand what will be deployed. To be honest, for the Vercel, we have a bunch of the pipelines. We have the pipelines to deploy certain brands, so because our client has different brands, and each brand is represented in different countries, and we can deploy them separately. We can deploy only one brand for all countries, or we can deploy the website for only one website or only one country, or even we can deploy everything in the Vercel in one pipeline, which is called all. And I have not introduced it here, but we also have the pipeline which deploy all parties in the same time. But anyway, we decided for us that it is better way to keep everything under the control and implement custom pipelines to deploy all this stuff, but even each of them has own tool to improve and simplify the deployments. But we kind of use it anyway. We use the native CLI tools provided of each of these tool. Like we use XM Cloud CLI to proceed the deployments to the XM Cloud, Vercel CLI to deployments to the Vercel. But anyway, we run and we track the deployments from our Azure DevOps environment. And at the end of my presentation, just a few things that I mentioned probably before, and which can help to specify, to configure some certain stuff in XM Cloud. And the first thing is that which is external editing host configuration. So if you want to use the external editing host, we have to specify the URLs and host names for that will point corresponding applications somewhere in the Vercel or any other tools where you run your rendering host. We also need to make sure that we have specified the JSS editing secret, which should be the same as we set for environment variable in our application, front-end application. Usually it is done by patching the config. And for the Vercel specifically, that if you want to use it as an external editing host, we have to set to configure our out of the process editing data cache for Vercel, and there is an option to use the Vercel KV cache or any other Redis cache hosted in somewhere you want. There is a link. And last thing, probably if you want to use the existing like the editing host running in XM Cloud, you have to add the corresponding rendering hosts in your XM Cloud deploy or XM Cloud build JSON file, even you use the same code, you need to specify it if you, the number, so for each website, and where the name of the website should be a name of node inside of your JSON file. I think I'm pretty it, and if you have any questions, I'm going to answer them.
What is your experience using Sitecore CLI for deployment? So in your example, you had the connected deploy, right, with XM Cloud and
Yes.
your GitHub. Have you ever experienced using the CLI for deployments, wherein your repository
Yes.
is behind a firewall?
Yes. We actually use we started building the solution for this client before even XM Cloud was introduced the ability to use our Azure DevOps repository for the deployments, for the automated deployments implemented in XM Cloud itself. So we had to use CLI to run our deployments anyway. But even now, as far as I know, as far as I remember, XM Cloud added the ability to use to use Azure DevOps as a storage for your code. For me, it is easy and more clear way to deploy. Using the CLI, we run build first in our Azure DevOps pipeline. So running this build in pipeline, we make sure that it will be successfully built in the DevOps. And once we make sure of that, then we keep the code as a build artifacts for our deployment. And when we're ready to push it to the XM Cloud with the separate pipelines, or let's say release pipeline, then we use these artifacts, which has tagged with some number of build. We use again XM Cloud CLI to push it to the XM Cloud, and then build happened again, but on the XM Cloud itself. So the build of pipeline and the release of the pipeline is still remain the same, but the code is not pulled by XM Cloud itself. So we push this code to the XM Cloud with the CLI.
Got it. Thank you. And just one final question: when you're connecting to an external editing host in Vercel, is your editing host in Vercel and the live app both the same?
In our case, yes, it is the same, but there is probably different way how we can do that. If you require the separate applications running even from the separate branch for the preview, then you can use and run your editing host separately. So, but it is pretty requires the requirement of the client, how they expect to preview and edit their content.
Okay, looks like that's it. Artem, thank you very much for this insightful presentation.
You're welcome, guys.
It was always a pleasure seeing you sharing the knowledge.
This is basically use case that we experienced recently. And I think I have one of my colleagues on the call, Jack Spector, also. So Jack and I were working on this the last few weeks, trying to figure out a solution. But essentially, if I go forward, what I was hoping to share today is the actual problem statement that we faced, the approach that we took, and in a sense, just go through what is Sitecore GraphQL. I bet that everyone knows GraphQL in this group, but just a simple sample query and common best practices. We'll look at the difference between querying content via Experience Edge versus the CD delivery endpoint, some security considerations, and the role of a CDN. And I'll tell you why I've included that, and some identified limitations, and we'll open up for questions. The reason why I've got CD delivery endpoint in there and the reason why I've got CDN in there is because we are on Sitecore version 10.3 running on Kubernetes. We do not have Experience Edge and we do not have XM Cloud. So we are not yet in that SaaS space and we don't have access to Experience Edge. There is a separate activity that is going on to look at XM Cloud and moving to XM Cloud and using Experience Edge. But at this stage, we had to improvise with what we had, which is version 10.3 and the CDN that we have. Just a quick intro. I won't take too much time here. My name is Navneet Pisharodi. I am a solution architect working here in Auckland, New Zealand. I'm based in Auckland, New Zealand. I'm a 3-time MVP, and I've been in the software engineering space for 20 plus years. And off late, when I say off late, in the past couple of years, or probably slightly more, I've slowly started becoming a lot more passionate towards leveraging the Mac architecture to drive flexible, scalable, and future-proof digital experiences. And maybe that passion eventually landed me on this GraphQL scenario that we are about to look at. There's a few different social channels that I'm on, but to be honest, I mostly just look at LinkedIn. So if you do need to reach out, please do send me a message on LinkedIn. I'll be more than happy to respond and connect. So just going into the problem statement, as I did say, we have Sitecore version 10.3 in-house that is actively used by our marketing team. And we surface quite a few very critical retail websites to our customers here in New Zealand. And everything's working fine, no issues. But then on the other side, we also have a few other critical customer value offerings that run on other platforms like Azure and AWS, and there are, I think, a few hosted on Vercel, and we also have React Native mobile apps that are also driving value to customers. Now, of course, the biggest gap, and obviously you all might have a question why we have that segregation of implementation where you've got one that is going through Sitecore and one that is going through a non-Sitecore channel. Obviously, those were some of the legacy decisions that were taken, and as such, they're sitting separate. But we're also looking at an activity to kind of consolidate them. But one of the concerns that our marketing team highlighted is we had content authors who wanted to make content changes on these disconnected apps. They had marketing content that was a way for them to connect with the customers. They had to, they constantly run campaigns, and they had campaign marketing content and so on. But the biggest challenge was with Sitecore, it's straightforward. They could go into the CMS, make the change, publish, and it's visible for the customer. But with these other channels, there was a very tedious process of reaching out to the delivery team, getting the changes implemented in the code, pushing that out as a deployment. Obviously, any production deployments request a change window. So it was a painful change process, which meant by the time our marketing team sometimes get their changes across to customers, there is always a significant delay. And that essentially is more or less a failure of their campaign activity. Plus that unwanted dependency on the ID team. It is basically, you're taking one step back on why you have a CMS, right? One of the key benefits of having a CMS is you minimize the dependency on IT, and you give more power to the marketing team or the e-commerce team in our case, and they'll have the capability to make changes on the live website and connect better with customers. So long story short, they came back to us and they said, look, we are happy with how the page is performing in terms of all those disconnected apps, and we are happy how the sites are performing, but we are not happy with how the process is in terms of getting content out to customers. And as I did say, we do have version 10.3 internally in our landscape, and it was easy for us to use version 10.3. So what we looked at is, one, obviously we had that CMS capability in-house, and we also had our CDN. In our case, it's Cloudflare, but we had the Cloudflare CDN sitting in front that was acting as that security layer that caching layer and that performance layer that we needed. So one thing we looked at is there a way we can utilize Sitecore's content APIs to query Sitecore, retrieve content in a structured manner that can be used by these front-end applications, be it applications hosted on Vercel, Azure, AWS, or React Native apps. And in a high level, the way we envisioned is when a customer is making a page request for an app that's hosted on, let's say, as an example, Vercel, when the page is being loaded, obviously the page would consist of, say, a part of the page would be enterprise information that's coming from our enterprise service layer. And a part of the page content would actually be marketing content or dynamic marketing content that the customers need to see, the content that our marketing team manage. So essentially, when Vercel loads the page, we wanted an option where Vercel would be calling one of our content APIs within Sitecore CMS. And as soon as the call comes in, the call would go through our CDN layer. If there is a cache, the call would basically, the response would be sent back to the consumer from the CDN itself. But if there is no cache, the call would go into our CMS, the response would be constructed, it would be cached on the CDN and sent back to the front-end consumer. So on a high level, that is what we had in mind. Obviously, that caching capability on this CDN or on the edge essentially meant that you also needed a way to purge your cache, because Sitecore content can change constantly, and you don't want to kind of show stale content to customers consistently. So we also kind of put in some sort of a TTL aspect into that cache on CDN. So in summary, front-end consumers will utilize content APIs to retrieve dynamic marketing content from our Sitecore CMS, and our CDN will act as a caching and security layer. You'll now understand why I kind of in my agenda slide, I said no experience edge, because we don't have experience edge. In a way, we'll have to use our CDN to mimic some of those capabilities that experience edge provides us, with the intention that whatever we are implementing here is easily migratable into Experience Edge and XM Cloud as and when that happens. So we're not looking to kind of build something that we have to take down and rebuild if we were to migrate to Experience Edge and XM Cloud. We want to build something that is easily migratable, yet achieve something with what we have at hand. So what is Sitecore GraphQL? And Artsem basically shared that IDE, and thanks for that, Artsem. I don't have that picture in my presentation, so it's good for you all to have seen that in the other presentation. But what is Sitecore GraphQL? It is basically, it's just a generic GraphQL service platform that sits on top of Sitecore. It hosts data and presents it through GraphQL queries. The key aspect to highlight here is we are not trying to build a new GraphQL server. We are just going to be using Sitecore's GraphQL service platform to query for data and use the data in our front-end consumers. Sitecore GraphQL endpoints support the following types of GraphQL requests. Obviously, we've got HTTP post requests using query and JSON and GraphQL query and so on. But if you'll notice, I have highlighted HTTP GET with query string parameters. And there is a reason why we went with HTTP GET, and it is also tied to the reason that we don't have Experience Edge. But I'll come back to that in just a minute. Another benefit of using Sitecore GraphQL, as I did say, is if we keep our queries optimized, or if we keep our queries, when we construct our queries, if you do keep in mind that eventually we'll also be landing on Experience Edge and XM Cloud, if we are optimizing our queries appropriately, then migrating this GraphQL implementation that we are about to do into a future Experience Edge or XM Cloud will be seamless. We don't see any sort of, there won't be much rework aside of maybe repointing our API-based URL from looking at our CD instance to Experience Edge. That's where we want to get to. I think everyone's familiar, but I thought of putting this in because I have not worked a lot on GraphQL, and I did quite a bit of reading and learning initially. So in case this helps anyone, but this is basically how a sample GraphQL query structure would look like. In this case, you'll notice that we are querying the items. We are getting the ID and name of each item. We are getting the template details for that particular item. And we're also retrieving the list of fields, including the name and the value. But it's not the query in the picture that matters. If you kind of relate GraphQL to a REST API, and if you had wanted to retrieve all this information, imagine how complex that would be. Imagine how many requests you would have to make before you can actually construct this information. So that's the power of GraphQL, is that it basically requests the exact data that you need rather than overfetching or underfetching, or making more requests, or making resource-intensive infrastructure calls in comparison to REST API. So REST API is, I'm not saying REST API is bad, it's just that GraphQL is one step ahead in terms of optimized querying of content. On the flip side, I've not mentioned that in this document, but on the flip side, the power of GraphQL also means that it's really easy to construct queries that are super complex and super resource intensive, and even queries that can easily bring down your infrastructure. So it's got both ends of the spectrum, but for the sake of implementation, I'm sure everyone will look at the positive side and maybe have controls in place to prevent the negative aspect. Some common best practices. Again, this is more of a few things that we thought about. This is not an exhaustive list. There's probably a lot more that you all are aware of and that I've not mentioned here. But point number one is always optimize queries with fragments. Use fragments to avoid repeating code and optimize queries. One easy way to understand fragments is a helper function that we all have been used to in the past. Like, for example, as a simple example is if you are trying to create an addition of a plus b, rather than implementing that a plus b across every 10 or 20 different places where you're trying to do addition, it's always good to have a helper function and call the helper function in those 10 other places. So that way you only make change in one place and you're reusing that. Similarly, GraphQL has this concept called fragments. In this case, you can see that we've got the user fields fragment that has the user's ID, email, and name. And the get users query is basically invoking the fragment or using that fragment to query the database. That's one. The second one is use descriptive names. Use clear and descriptive names for types, fields, to improve readability and maintainability. We've had other examples when we were developers. I've myself have done quite a lot of mistakes where I've not been as descriptive as I should have been, and that has taken a hit on maintainability and readability going forward, because at times I wonder what exactly have I coded. So obviously I've improved quite a lot, but just want to highlight that all of us, when we kind of define queries, be as descriptive with your type names. Number three is implement error handling. Obviously, when someone is calling your endpoint and the data is going back, it'll also help front-end consumers if you actually have appropriate error messages embedded into your response if there is an error. So try to see if you can support them with appropriate error handling. The fourth one is use contextual data fetching. So structure queries to fetch related content efficiently, minimizing the number of requests. Now, in this case, you've got article response that we are querying. An article response internally has the article. Your article internally might be reusing that user that you see on the under number one, which will then give the author information. So basically, structure your query in a proper way so that it's easy to kind of manage and maintain that going forward. Also keep in mind that whenever you create your query contract or whenever you design your query, keep it as lean and as less complex as you can. There is reason behind that, and I'll come to that in the next couple of slides. Now, querying Sitecore content for us, we looked at two options. Even though we did not have experience edge, we kind of toyed with an idea whether it'll be worth going and adding experience edge to our license. On the left is basically our version 10.3 if we had Experience Edge. So for example, your content management would have your preview on your preview endpoint where you can see draft content, but then it'll also have the Edge connector, which would, as and when content is published, it would basically publish the items, layout, snapshot, and media into Experience Edge. Now, obviously, we did not have that, which meant we had to come and look at how we can achieve something similar using our CD delivery endpoint. With the CDA delivery endpoint, you still have this content management and the content delivery servers. Your content delivery server or the CD would have the delivery endpoint, whereas the content management server would have your preview endpoint. And as the name suggests, preview is draft content, and content delivery basically gives you the published content. Now, that is a better option for us because for one, configuring GraphQL on our 10.3 was straightforward. It was available as a part of our license, and enabling that was pretty much an easy activity. And secondly, we could still use the GraphQL capability against our delivery endpoint. And the third part was being on 10.3, we had the added benefit that the schema more or less aligns with the schema that's used on the Experience Edge. So in a way, all of those worked in our favor, and we decided to go with the content delivery endpoint with our CDN layer sitting in front. So I've not represented the CDN layer here because I pulled this out of a pack, this image out of a pack. But if you look at the load balancer and the headless application, between both of those, there is actually the Cloudflare CDN sitting that acts as our secure caching layer. A few different security considerations that we looked at when we thought of this opportunity is one, and I think this is also mentioned in Sitecore's documentation, is it is always recommended that all GraphQL API calls originate from the server and not from the browser. Obviously, that leads on to the Sitecore API key aspect that the API keys should also be protected. In our case, we had another complexity that our security, so we also have e-commerce on our sites, and we've got PCI and all sorts of concerns that our security look into. So we only had approval to use GET requests. We could not use GraphQL's post. And that was one reason why in a few slides back, I had the HTTP GET highlighted and none of the HTTP posts, because we actually use HTTP GET. Another reason, I think I might be jumping forward, but another reason why we've only decided to do GET requests is because you can only cache GET requests on your Cloudflare CDN. You can't out of the box cache your post requests on CDNs. Cloudflare does not allow that. You might be able to achieve it with Cloudflare Pages and Cloudflare Workers and other options, but out of the box, caching a GET request was much more easier in comparison to exploring how to cache a post request. Looking at the API key itself, obviously the API key must be protected. But one more thing which we did is we are executing that API request using the API key under an impersonated user. And that Sitecore user only has restricted access to read specific parts of our Sitecore tree that holds public marketing content. So that is another benefit or gate that we added, is even if we get compromised, it's only going to a point where they can pull out public marketing content. They're not going to pull out anything that is internal. A third option that Sitecore does give us, and in general the GraphQL community recommends, is always look at how to prevent resource-intensive GraphQL requests. You could define complexity configurations within your Sitecore configuration. The three key ones being max depth, which is how deep the nesting can go in a query, your field impact, how many average items, object models will the query return, and max complexity, that is, if a query retrieves a list of posts and each post has multiple comments, the more the nested your query is, the more complex the query is, the more resource intensive the query is. And you could, if you have not tightened your entry into your infrastructure, you could also be DDoSed with significantly resource intensive complex queries. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind. Now, those are default values there. I don't recommend going with those values that you see there. I would definitely fine tune your query so that your max complexity is much, much lesser than what you see on the screenshot. A few other things that we did look at is query whitelisting. Now, when Jack and I were looking at it, we were also a bit confused when it said whitelisting cache. So we were not sure whether the query response was itself cached or what does whitelisting actually mean. So we did go back a few times with Sitecore. Essentially, what that means is it captures query to files to only allow captured queries in the whitelisted mode. So for example, if you've got a query that you define and say, look, this front-end consumer can use this query, essentially, as long as the incoming query matches what Sitecore has captured into the file, it'll allow the query to pass through, but otherwise it won't. Similarly, it provides a pointer or hash for the query. So you could basically use the hash to actually call the query rather than sending the entire load. Another one is this gives the added benefit of adding your files to your source control so that you can push that into all of the upstream environments. So in summary, the response is never cached. A GraphQL query response is never cached by Sitecore. This is more of whitelisting the actual query itself. Another one, as I did highlight, we've got all sorts of PCI and sensitive restrictions that we need to adhere to. So we did turn off mutations and subscriptions. So we've ensured that we are not writing or modifying anything within Sitecore, which is actually good for us because we only need to read marketing content. But my suggestion is if you don't need mutations and subscriptions, just turn off where it's not necessary. You can just limit to just querying public marketing content. And then looking at CDN for caching and security, we do use Cloudflare. We basically use cache our query response on Cloudflare with an appropriate edge time to live, and which essentially means that from a business experience perspective, when a content author is publishing a content change, it may take a few minutes before that content change is visible on the front end. Which was perfectly fine with our business folks because as of now, they were not able to manage anything on our non-Sitecore apps. With this sort of an option, at least it gives them an option where they can push the content and within a few minutes, that content will be visible on the front-end app. That was one. And another thing that we could do with the CDN sort of approach is, let's say you are hosted on Vercel, and let's say you've access to, or you have the ability to add Vercel secure compute add-on to your license. What Vercel does is Vercel gives you 2 dedicated static IPs, which are IPs from where all of your Vercel server traffic originates from, which means all you have to do is you basically take those 2 IPs, whitelist them on your Cloudflare CDN or any sort of CDN, and all of the traffic coming from your Vercel server would actually be trusted traffic that can go into Sitecore. In our case, we also looked at another option where we have explored setting up custom rules within our CDN, and we've explored passing a secure header API key as a part of your GraphQL server request, which means that key is only known to the Vercel server and to our CDN. So there's an extra layer of validation to make sure that any request that's coming in is also from a trusted source. Plus, on the CDN, we've kind of limited any sort of GraphQL calls to only be using the method type get and reject everything else. And I don't know if this is the final slide, probably, but there were some limitations that we've identified. The first one that I did read in Sitecore documentation is the experience edge query complexity is limited to 250. If I go back a couple of slides, you'll notice that in this, the max complexity is set to 2000. So the limitation or the flip side is that if you are working against your local instance of Sitecore, be it Kubernetes or your local instance, you've got the flexibility to work on your queries. So you could, design a complex query and you could update your Sitecore configuration and it would still go through because you have complete control over the max complexity. But it would inadvertently introduce complex queries that will need rework if you're migrating to Experience Edge and XM Cloud, because Experience Edge has a limit And it'll be good if our queries are designed in such a way that we are within the limit, so that way migration becomes a lot more easier. The second thing is, with Experience Edge, of course, you've got that cache handling, including the cache purge and refresh, everything happening out of the box. You don't need to do any sort of custom logic to handle that. But in our case, being all of those capability is in our CDN, which means there is a maintenance overhead. For now, we are happy to live with the maintenance overhead, but we eventually would explore an option where we can move to Experience Edge and XM Cloud. So all of this, what you see in this slide deck, is more for those who are actually working, who are not yet on XM Cloud, but who are envisioning to be on Experience and XM Cloud soon, but still want to kind of use the GraphQL capability locally or with the current stage. Another one was, as I did say, limited to use the Sitecore GraphQL HTTP GET with query string parameters, so that we can allow out-of-the-box caching with CDN, because otherwise caching of the queries was becoming a bit of a challenge. Plus, we definitely don't want to allow every single GraphQL request to hit the Sitecore server and put a load on the server. We wanted a scenario where, on our edge, which is the CDN, Cloudflare caches most of the requests and only sends one request in to actually refresh the cache. In our case, there's two ways you could do that too. One is, you have 10 users coming in. The first user would get the updated content, all of that from Sitecore. All of the remaining 9 users would then be hitting the cache, which means the response would be amazingly quick. Then at one point, the cache might expire, which means the very next customer who's accessing our site would get the hit into Sitecore, which means there would be a slightly longer response time. But if your query is optimized, that wouldn't be an issue. But one of the other options that we saw with the CDN, like Cloudflare, or I think Akamai and others would be having it too, is you could have that stale while revalidate. So you could get Cloudflare to do that proxy call to retrieve the updated content, rather than a customer having to experience that slight additional response time. So there are various options that you can look at that'll work in your favor. But I think that's all I had. I didn't look at the chat, but I'm happy to answer any questions if I missed anything. If none, then I'll pass it back to you, Martin.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just thought to add something that we also had one. I just remember we had one thing with when we were setting up GraphQL endpoint, that if you have lots of custom pipelines, it's best to basically manually skip them if it's going through the GraphQL endpoint, because this could seriously slow the GraphQL working. And if you have like a session, you can also check if you can disable that for GraphQL. This could help with performance-wise.
Yep, that's a good point. Thanks, Jack. Yeah.
That was pretty insightful. I loved a couple approaches you shared about the security concepts. So what I'm thinking is, now we have an option of using Experience Edge as a black box product. We also have an option of doing things by our own. And I'm looking for some sort of a hybrid approach, maybe something in between of this. So let's imagine something looking like Experience Edge, but provided to you as a self-hosted option. So maybe something like that would be available for us in the future. And this will bring us all the benefits of black box as Experience Edge is. So that basically it's self-configured, it's fixed schema, like all of the things. But at the same time, maybe they will give us ability to configure that in some way. Of course, like I don't know how they do the hosting and scalability and other bits, but I'm definitely not happy with the limitations of Experience Edge. So that should be somehow extended. Again, this is my just thoughts and negotiations, and time will show, but that would
So
be
definitely,
definitely an option.
I think one more thing that I did read was Experience Edge is rate limited to 80 requests per second, which is actually high.
Yes,
Please
80
don't get me wrong. Yeah.
requests, correct.
But what happens if there are edge case scenarios where you've got 500 pages and, you know, for some reason you've got, you know, uncached requests coming all together at once? There could be rate limiting issues. Again, I don't know if that is actually an issue, but I was thinking that there could be edge case scenarios where we would be rate limited on Experience Edge if we are going with something other than static site generation.
At the same time, the API itself gives us some tools to overcome that, like repeat actions. So if the request fails, you can do retrieve again. So that's for fetching, and now it's also for build time there. So the tools try to overcome these limitations, but I would better not have these limitations in the first place.
Yep.
Wondering,
Cool.
are there any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, cool beans. I have a question about fragments. When we're talking about, optimizing our queries, is there a performance benefit that comes with fragments at all? Is it more so based on just making the query more readable if it's quite complex?
I've not seen, and Jack, feel free to add, but I've not seen a performance benefit as such. It's more of readability and maintainability for the queries that we construct.
Okay, that's what I assumed.
I
wasn't sure.
I think I'm not 100% sure, but I think you can register fragments like in your client. Like when you're using Apollo, for example, in PM package, you can register your fragment, and then I don't know if it helps Apollo, but it may somehow improve performance. But it's at least will make your query smaller on your client side as well. So yeah, from that perspective,
Gotcha. Thanks.
Any more questions? Okay, if no more questions, thank you very much, Navneet. It was very, very, very insightful. And as I say, I absolutely enjoy talks about GraphQL, because lots of interesting areas, how you can approach that, like different access, how you can approach that. With that in mind, this concludes our user group. The next one will be out on December 12th. If anyone is willing to speak, please reach out to me with your topic and short description. I am always happy to host new faces. All right, bye-bye.